havoc in human lives, and it has become like an elephant being described by a blind man. So it all started in Wuhan city in the Hubei province of China in December 2019, and hence named as COVID-19. From there, it spread to China, became an epidemic, and then to the world, becoming a pandemic. And we are still in the pandemic going long for last 6 months. Now, all over the world, COVID-19 has affected people in crores. Like the world data, this is the recent one where more than 1.7 crore people have been affected. Of course, 1.26, more than that has recovered, and deaths were about 6,85,000 and so on. In our country, till recently, number of cases affected was 1.7 million, out of which 1.09 million have recovered and 36,511 deaths recorded. And in the state of Maharashtra, about 4,22,000 people affected, 1,88,000 have recovered, and there were about 14,994 reported few days ago. So it is an important human and animal pathogen. And at the end of 2019, as I've already said, it was identified as the cause of cluster of pneumonia and became a pandemic. Previously, it was named as 2019 nCoV. And this novel coronavirus originated in some animals like the snakes, the marked civet, hedgehogs, rhizomes, bats, and pangolins. This time, it is said to be, it has originated from the seafood market in Wuhan, and it was supposed to be from the snakes. Then from animals, it went to humans, and now it's human-to-human transmission. So these coronaviruses are actually enveloped, positive sense, single-stranded RNA viruses, which affect a variety of host species, which are divided into 4 genera, alpha, beta, gamma, and delta, based on their genomic structure. Alpha and beta coronaviruses infects only mammals. Human coronaviruses such as 229E and LN63 are responsible for common cold and croup and belong to alpha coronavirus. SARS-CoV, MERS-CoV, and SARS-CoV-2 are all classified as beta coronaviruses. So severe acute respiratory syndrome, which you all must have heard, had been reported from Asia in February 2003. This was caused by a strain of coronavirus, which primarily infected the upper respiratory tract and the GI tract of mammals and birds, and 6 different currently known strains of coronavirus infect humans. This caused respiratory viral illness, which was it is called as SARS. And then we had this MERS, which is Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which was also caused by a different strain of coronavirus. This presented with respiratory illness and symptoms of fever, cough, and shortness of breath in 2013. This was a little more dangerous variety, and about 3 or 4 out of every 10 patients that time had died because of MERS. And it is an airborne transmission basically. This coronavirus family has the property of surviving in dry air or surfaces for up to 3 hours. In fact, more than that. In some instances, on some surfaces, it has been reported to survive up to a week. In these conditions, the virus crystallizes and can float in the air like dust. It is suspected that SARS virus can also be transmitted in this manner, which is already proven now, in fact. So it is a person-to-person transmission, either by respiratory droplets or close contact. When a person coughs or sneezes, the virus it travels to a distance of about 6 weeks and 6 feet and can infect anyone between the vicinity. And also it is transmitted by touching. When a person coughs, the virus gets excreted out and it settles down on the surfaces. And when someone touches the surfaces, the hands get infected. And when they touch their face, like the eyes, the nose or mouth, the viruses gets transmitted and that person acquires infection. It can also be close personal contact like touching or shaking of the hands. So mean incubation period is about 5 days, but it can range from 1 to 14 days. In fact, they say it can be up to 27 or 28 days. In 95% of cases, symptoms are at its peak in about 12.5 days of contact when actually the complications can start happening. And one person is likely to infect about 2.6 persons. And then these 2.6 persons infect another 2.6 persons each. So it multiplies in transmission. The symptoms of COVID-19, the usual symptoms are, the most commonest is the fever, followed by dry cough mostly. It could be productive cough, it could be hemoptysis as well. There can be shortness of breath or difficulty in breathing, fever can be associated with chills. There's body aches, pains, headaches, sore throat, loss of taste or smell, congestion or runny nose, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. All the symptoms have not, of course, been mentioned here, but these are the common symptoms we commonly see the patients coming with. And this is the pictorial presentation of the same. So incubation period, as I said, can be extended up to 27 to 28 days. Recovery time is 3 weeks to 6 weeks. So the frequently reported symptoms, as I've said, is the fever is the most commonest one. It is 77 to 98% of patients it is seen in. Cough is seen in 46 to 82% of patients. Myalgia or fatigue in 11 to 52%. Shortness of breath could be seen anywhere from 3 to 31% of patients. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain has been reported in about 50% of patients, especially in the children. And the less commonly reported ones are the sore throat, headache, cough with sputum production, and hemoptysis. So depending on the symptoms, it is divided into different grades, like the mild, moderate, severe, and the critical one. Coming to a mild adult, mildly infected adult, they are symptomatic, they meet all the case definition, but there is no evidence of pneumonia or hypoxia. In the moderate one, in an adult, we have clinical signs of pneumonia, like febrile cough, dyspnea, tachypnea, but the saturations are well maintained above 90% on room air. While in a child, there are clinical signs of non-severe pneumonias, like cough or dyspnea, with tachypnea with or without recessions. In the severe form, in an adult, we have signs of pneumonia and of respiratory rate being more than 30 breaths per minute, and severe respiratory distress. Saturation is less than 90% on room air. In a child, there are signs of pneumonia and any of central cyanosis, saturations less than 90% on the room air, severe respiratory distress like grunting, very severe recessions, any red flag like inability to take oral feed, breastfeed, lethargy, loss of consciousness, seizures, tachypnea, like in a less than 2-month-old baby, it is respiratory rate is more than 60. Between 2 to 11 months, it's more than 50, and 1 to 5 years, more than 40. And the critical ones are those who land up in ARDS, sepsis, and septic shock. So this can explain better the different stages depending on the viral response phase and the host inflammatory response phase. The stage 1, according to the severity of illness, the stage 1 is an viral response phase, which can progress to stage 2, which is a pulmonary phase, which is divided into 2 stages, 2A and 2B. By end of 2B, the viral response phase ends, and at the beginning of stage 2A, the host inflammatory response phase starts. And in the stage 3, there is hyperinflammation phase. The clinical symptoms, depending on the stages, are in stage 1, where there is early infection, patient comes with mild constitutional symptoms, fever of more than 99.6, dry cough, diarrhea, and headache. In the stage 2, there is shortness of breath and hypoxia, where PaO2 by FiO2 ratio is less than 300. And in the stage 3, there is ARDS, SIRS, shock, and cardiac failure. The clinical signs in different stages, like in mild stage, there is lymphopenia, increased prothrombin time, increased D-dimer, and mildly elevated LDH. In stage 2, it is abnormal chest imaging and low normal procalcitonin. While in stage 3, there are elevated inflammatory markers like CRP, LDH, IL-6, D-dimer, ferritin, troponin, NT-proBNP elevation. So depending on the stages, you have to decide on what therapy is to be given to the patient, whether patient requires hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, convalescent plasma therapy, will give to reduce immunosuppression, corticosteroids, immunomodulators, whatever, we have to decide accordingly. And the patients can land up in various complications like ARDS, which is seen in 29% of patients, RN anemia in 15%, cardiac injuries, acute cardiac injuries in 12%. Patients may present with AKI, that is acute kidney injury, CVAs, that is strokes, secondary infections in 10%. All these serious patients requiring ICU admissions are up to 32%. And this was a study done in China, in Wuhan, where the stage case fatality rates were seen, and maximum fatality was with those having cardiovascular disease, that was up to 10.5%, followed by diabetics, that is 7.3%, chronic respiratory disease 6.3%, hypertension 6%, and cancer patients 5.6% fatality rates. So going on to the investigations, of course, RT-PCR is still the gold standard of the investigation. Then we do a CBC, we do a coagulation profile in which we do D-dimer, fibrinogen, PTINR, then RFTs, LFTs, IL-6, CRP, ferritin, TROP-T, NT-proBNP, PCTs, ECG, especially for QTC, the X-ray chest, and the HRCT chest, which can all be done for investigations. And as I've said, that RT-PCR ideally should be collected from both the upper as well as the lower respiratory tract. But then lower respiratory tract, we do not advocate unless, of course, you're doing some procedure because they are aerosol generating. So upper respiratory tract samples ideally should be collected from both the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. And lower respiratory samples could be in the form of expectorated sputum, or if you're doing a bronchoscopy, then endotracheal aspirate or bronchoalveolar lavage. Endotracheal aspirate when the patient is on ventilator, and bronchoalveolar lavage when you're doing the procedure. So what would be the findings be? Like there can be, there is leukopenia. In fact, WBC count is low. There is lymphopenia. Lymphocytes are very low. The NL ratio, that is neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, which normally is less than 3, goes high. There is high prothrombin time, high D-dimer, high fibrinogen, high ferritin, SDOT and LDH is raised. Hypersensitive troponin may be increased. Procalcitonin on admission is usually normal, which is less than 0.1. But when there is secondary infection, the procalcitonin level goes up to more than 0.5. IL-6 and CRP are increased, and IL-6 is a predictor of a cytokine storm, so also CRP. This is normal, the X-ray picture of a COVID-19 positive patient, where you have pneumonitis, the GTOs, the pneumonias, which are peripheral, multilobular. This is the fluorescent picture. And this is the CT scan finding. The peripheral pneumonias mostly involving predominantly the lower lobes, but it could be multilobular. And the initial CT pattern in the COVID-19 is, in 88% of patients, you see ground glass opacification. In another 88%, you may see bilateral involvement. Posterior distribution is seen in 80% of patients. Multilobular involvement in 79%. Peripheral distribution in 76%, and consolidations in 32%. This is the score from which we know what is the severity, whether it is COVID or non-COVID, and what is the severity if it is there. So from CORAD 5 onwards, like 4 onwards, there is high suspicion. Grade CORAD 5 is high, typical of COVID-19, and usually at CORAD 6, we get PCRs positive. And other supportive diagnostic test is now, which is available, is the antigen test, which is again done through a nasopharyngeal swab. Reports are available within half an hour. Then we have this antibody test, that is IgM, IgG, total antibody test, combo test for COVID-19 for those patients who have recovered. If IgG is present, then they could be the likely candidates to donate their plasma. So this is the comparison, like antigen-based immunoassay is detectable from a few days after onset of symptom, and the sensitivity and specificity is between 50 to 70%. And the detection of asymptomatic infection will depend on the amount of viral antigen. And it is being used in some regions. Mumbai, we already have this. All over other places also, I think now it is available. Now, antibody-based immunoassay is, the analyte is an antibody which is detectable from day 7 to 28 days after the onset of symptoms. Like IgM gets detected in 7 days, and then from the second week onwards, the IgG gets detected. The sensitivity is 95%, but specificity is not clear. We don't know how long the antibodies will last. So to check that, you may have to keep on repeating the antibody test every month also. And detection of asymptomatic infection is at the later stage of infection. This is also being widely done these days. And the real-time PCR, the gold standard, the analyte is a gene which is detected in all stages. Sensitivity, specificity is good if it is done properly, especially from the lower respiratory tract when it is 95%. Otherwise, it is 70% from nasopharyngeal swab. And detection of asymptomatic infection is from the early stage of infection. And this test is being done all over the world in all the countries. So coming to the management, we have multiple options like antivirals, anticoagulation, very important, immunobooster, supportive treatment, then oxygen some patients may require. Steroids are required for some patients, ventilator management for some of them. Judicious fluid management is very important. Some of them in shock will require vasopressors and the immunomodulators. So antiviral, basically we have multiple antivirals available. like this lopinavir ritonavir combination, which we had used for a number of patients in Fortis, because we have had about 800 patients and we must have used it on about 600 at least. This is adult dose is 400 by 100 combination tablet, that is twice a day for 2 weeks. It's available as capsule as well as oral suspension. Another one is a combination of ribavirin plus ritonavir lopinavir, because ritonavir lopinavir is a protease inhibitor, while ribavirin is a nucleoside inhibitor also. So ribavirin can be given in the dose of 2.4 grams loading dose orally, followed by 1.2 gram every 12 hours for 10 days. And ritonavir lopinavir is same 400 by 100 combination twice a day for 2 weeks. Favipiravir have recently come up. It's an oral form. On day 1, we give 1800 milligram BID, followed by 800 twice a day for 2 weeks. Remdesivir we are using for serious patients. It is available as injectable. It is an RNA polymerase inhibitor. On day 1, we give 200 milligram, and then we give 100 milligram OD for another 4 days. That is total 5 days. There is in some cases people had given for 10 days, but there was no difference either giving for 5 days or 10 days. In fact, it is more hepatotoxic and also renal toxic. So it is better you give for 5 days and monitor LFTs and RFTs. And HCKs, that is hydroxychloroquine, again, so much of controversy. But my personal opinion is if you don't have any contraindications, and because we have been using this drug for ages, you should go on it. It has more of a role in prophylaxis, and therapeutic role is in milder cases. It is given the therapeutic dose of 400 milligram twice a day for day 1, and then 400 once a day for another 4 days, so total 5 days. Azithromycin, a macrolide, is said to have antiviral activity also. It is given in the dose of 500 once a day for 5 days. HCKs, azithromycin, both can cause QTC prolongation. And if there is a QTC prolongation, then you have to stop HCKs, azithromycin. In that case, you can even give ivermectin and doxycycline. For 5 days, doxycycline and ivermectin, again, there are different ways of giving. Some say it is 12 milligram OD for 2 days. Some say it's BD for 2 days. Some say it is OD for 5 days. So anticoagulation, coming to this, it's a very important part of the patient management, because we know now that thrombotic etiopathogenesis, and even after discharge, there are deaths reported after 10 days, 15 days because of thrombosis, clots, infarcts and all. So anticoagulation forms an important part of the management. It could be with heparin, unfractionated heparin, but then that requires APTT monitoring, and chances of bleeding are high, exposure of the staff is more. So we prefer giving low molecular weight heparin, enoxaparin 1 milligram per kg, or dalteparin 200 units, or even then inhibitor like fondaparinux can be given for 7 days. Then we follow with NOACs in those who are elderly or who have comorbidities. We give it for even 1 month also, depending on the patient. It is selective. And then NOACs could be anything like apixaban, rivaroxaban, edoxaban, or something. And then ecosprin also we use in elderlies and with comorbidities. Then immunoboosters. The immunoboosters also play an important role. Like zinc is very important. It has got antiviral activity also. The dose of zinc in COVID is 100 milligram per day. Vitamin C also an antioxidant immunobooster. For prophylaxis, a dose of 500 once a day is okay. For mild cases to moderate cases, 500 2 times. In serious cases, vitamin C is given in injectable form as a drug 3 times a day for 5 days. Vitamin D can be given as 60K alternate day for 3 doses, or you can even give it once a week for even 3 months, because most of the patients have vitamin D deficiency. Coming to steroids, methylprednisolone can be given in the dose of 40 to 120 milligram per day. Now, methylprednisolone has got mineralocorticoid as well as glucocorticoid activity. So in puffed up patients and all, it will cause more of puffiness. And dexamethasone is well studied now. So dexamethasone would be preferred in those cases. It is given in the dose of 6 milligram per day. But in some selected cases, you may have to give higher doses, like maybe BD or 3 times to start with. Then injection tocilizumab, which is given in the dose of 400 milligram in NS, that is 8 milligram per kg, can repeat the second dose after 24 to 48 hours if there's not that much of good response. That I will not go into detail because Dr. Ingle would be speaking about that. So also now itolizumab is recommended and has been included in the treatment guidelines. And unilastatin and Sepsivac also would be taken over by Dr. Ingle, but we have used both, and Sepsivac also for more than 60 patients, which we have the data also that would be discussed by Dr. Ingle. So I leave it here. Then we're going to the oxygen, like we have to monitor the saturation of the patients. If it is less than 90, we start with oxygen. Like nasal cannula, you can give up to 3 liters. If not maintained with that, we go to NRBM, where you can give up to 15 liters of oxygen. If it is still not maintained, then we go to HFNC, that is high flow nasal cannula, where you can give oxygens even up to 80 liters, and that is the best preferred treatment. And with that also, if the patient is not maintaining, then we put the patient on ventilator. Now, if the patient is not maintaining on HFNC, we should immediately put the patient on ventilator and not waste the precious time. Again, judicious fluid management is very, very important. As I've said, that most patients come with nausea, vomitings, loose motion. So hydration needs to be maintained, because if patients are dehydrated, it adds to the thrombotic status, and patients should not be overhydrated. Otherwise, it will cause lung issues. And then if the patient has shock, then vasopressors may be required, for which adrenaline is preferred, not dopamine. So then, and there's another one that is convalescent plasma therapy, which involves transfusing plasma, which is retrieved from the blood of people who have recovered from COVID-19, and that is transfused into the patient who is suffering from COVID-19. One person can donate 2 people. Scientists say that a patient need only 1 transfusion to get enough antibodies to fight the virus. How much it would be useful is again a question mark, but it is being tried at many places these days. So as like, if you don't want to fall serious because of this COVID infection, then as for any other problem, prevention is always better than cure. And the vaccine has not come yet. We don't know how would the vaccine be effective, how much effective it would be. So if you remember SMS, that is social distancing, use of a proper mask, and sanitization, that itself is a vaccine by itself. So WHO recommends to wash our hands frequently with soap and water properly for 20 seconds each time. Avoid close contact with those displaying the symptoms. Cover your mouth and nose properly. The mask has to be put, and while removing, you have to remove from the strings from the back. Do not touch the outside portion of the mask, and then avoid direct contact with live animals in the markets, and consume only thoroughly cooked food, meat, and eggs. Avoid spitting in the public. Seek medical care if you have a fever, cough, and difficulty in breathing. And then last few slides, maybe 2 or 3 slides, because now initially there was lockdown. Many people had not been going out. Even the doctors were not practicing. But then this corona has already affected the livelihood of people, and people have now gone back to their work. So for the doctors who are going back to the clinic, we should follow some etiquettes, because anyone can get infected from anyone. So who should protect from whom? Actually, both the patient as well as the doctor. Doctor is at high risk, because being a healthcare worker, he can transmit the infection, and even patient can get in the infection. So at the first place, better to encourage virtual consultation, that is by either telephonic, audio, or video consultation. Then if you feel that patient actually requires physical examination, which we avoid actually, then only better call the patient to your clinic by a prior appointment. And 1 patient with 1 attendant. If the patient is able to manage himself, it's better he comes alone. Do not call too many relatives inside. Avoid overcrowding. And when the patient comes with the relatives, they should put the mask on properly. And overcrowding in the clinic, I said, should be avoided. Maintain social distance in the clinic. When they come in, sanitize their hands with the sanitizer, and then let them in. Then when they come to the clinic, let the receptionist or your staff check the temperature from a distance, and then with the help of pulse oximeter, check the vitals like pulse and O2 saturation. And for a doctor in the OPD, this is must. Wear a cap, wear a N95 mask for a doctor, proper gown, shoe cover, and the gloves and the shield. This is must. And make the patient sit preferably at a distance of 6 feet, otherwise at least 3 feet. And e-payment should be encouraged, because even the currencies can transmit the virus. And after the patient leaves, sanitize your clinic. That's all from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank
Over
you.
to you.
Yeah, thank you. Also, that was a great insight into the current scenario that we are having and currently available options and what are their status. So that was a great elaboration of the current system. So very nice of you. Thank you, man. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So,
Thanks.
moving forward with today's session. So I'd now like to invite Dr. Atul Ingli for his talk on immunomodulators in COVID-19. So I would like to hand over the session to Dr. Atul Ingli.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Good evening, Chair Dr. Mohit, my co-speaker Dr. Farah and Dr. Sucheta, and my dear friends. First of all, let me thank you from bottom of my heart for attending this session today, even it's a Sunday and at 7 o'clock. Today I will be discussing Sepsivac as an immunomodulator in COVID-19. Don't get scared by listening to this word immunomodulation or immunomodulator. Believe me, it's pretty simple and practical. One should have one thought or one should have at least one look towards it. What is Sepsivac? Sepsivac is basically a heat-killed Mycobacterium indicus proni, also known as Mycobacterium W or Mycobacterium wiki. It shares several antigens with Mycobacterium tuberculosis and leprae. So let's start discussion with the COVID. This is typical Indian COVID-19, I should say, because Indian society is male dominant, and so COVID infection. If you look at the infection rate, males are more affected, almost 76% against 24% of females, while deaths or mortality, again, I would compare it with males having 73% of mortality and females having 27% of mortality. What is so striking or stunning is that if you look at the death rate or mortality, which is more common in the age group of 21 to 40 as compared to the global data. The global data has said that the mortality is more after the age of 55 or 60, but exactly reverse is being seen in India. Second most important point where I would like to draw your attention is that 86% of deaths or 86% of mortality is in the patients with the chronic elements like diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, or even kidney disease. If you look at the life cycle of SARS-CoV-2, it has got 5 stages. Stage 1 is an attachment where virus binds to the host receptor. Stage 2 is a penetration where virus enters host cell through endocytosis or membrane fusion. Stage 3 is biosynthesis, where once viral contents are released inside the host cell, viral RNA enters the nucleus for replication. Viral mRNA is being used to make viral proteins. The fourth stage is maturation, where new viral particles are made, and the last stage is release of this new viral particle, so to infect more number of cells. Coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2 has got 4 structural proteins, that is spike S, membrane M, envelope E, and nucleocapsid N. The most important functional unit of this SARS-CoV-2 virus is spike S protein, which is subclassified into S1 and S2. S1 is meant for the attachment to the cell, while S2 is meant for the fusion with the cell membrane. Now, everybody knows that angiotensin converting enzyme 2 or S2 receptors are identified as a functional receptor for SARS-CoV-2. Dr. Farah has told you in the beginning that this disease has started from the animal market of Wuhan. According to the genomic sequencing, SARS-CoV-2 is about 89% identical to bad SARS like CoV-ZX C21 virus, 82% identical to human SARS-CoV, and about 50% identical to MERS-CoV. So probably it has started from back. And hypothesis or theories doesn't seem to be wrong. Now, if you look at the S expression, from where this virus can gain entry or which organs, it's the nasal cavity, lungs, ileum, heart, eyes, liver, bladder, kidney, pancreas, brain, prostate, and placenta. Even placenta, mother can transmit disease directly to the fetus. Why males and olders are more affected? That is a big question mark. Everybody must be thinking that it is because of its expression. Yes, you are right. Lung has got a highest expression of S2 receptors, but that is not the reason, because there is no difference in S2 expression amongst the gender or age. What is the different point? What is the different point which indicates or which provides the clue about the severity of the illness? That is the immune signature. In females and younger ones, it's a weak immune signature, while in males and olders, it has got a strong immune signature. And that is the reason it suggests that excessive immune response, what we call it as a cytokine storm, could be more likely to occur in males and the older population who gets infected with SARS-CoV or SARS-CoV-2. So it's not a S2 expression, it is an immune signature which is important for the severity of the disease. Who gets more affected? Aging or aged. Aging has been rechristened as inflammaging because there is an increased S2 expression, increased ROS, and reduced autophagy or auto-killing of either cells. Then diabetics, hypertensive, COPDs, ISDs, vitamin D deficiency. Now look at this, obesity, CKD, and immunocompromised persons. I mark it in the red purposefully because what we have seen, the mortality is highest in these three categories. Most of the patients would get complicated involvement of one organ or more than one organ. If you look at the CDC data and percentage of patients developing ARDS, if you look at the overall infected patients, the rate is 3 to 17%. But this rate increases when patient gets hospitalized, 20 to 42%, or ICU, it is worse, 67 to 85%. If you take a look at the mortality rate among the patients admitted in ICU, it is almost 39 to 72%. Of course, this was a pretty old data, dated somewhere around April. Coming to the course of COVID-19, I am not interested, I am not going into details of it. My area of interest is stage 2A, where post-inflammatory response phase starts. And that is what we are going to discuss it over here today. If you look at this picture, the virus gets attached to the epithelial cells of the respiratory system. From these epithelial cells, they get attached to either dendritic or macrophages, which are situated just below the epithelium. If you look at this figure, the attachment is to the spikease protein and it gets attached to TLR4 receptors. This is a direct virus attachment I am telling you. Now, if suppose the epithelial cell or any macrophage or dendritic cell gets infected with this virus, they may get attached over here, and this is DPP4 expression. So now this can be area of interest in future studies, because if you use DPP4 inhibitors, you might get benefited. Person or human being has got two types of immunities, innate and adaptive. Innate immunity is a rapid response which is carried out by these macrophages, dendritic cell, mast cells, basophils, then eosinophils and neutrophils. But adaptive immunity is a late response which is carried out by most of the time T and B lymphocytes. What is the difference between this innate and adaptive immunity? What is the importance? Innate immunity is something already present in the body, while adaptive immunity is created in response to the exposure to a foreign substance. Innate immunity is non-specific, while adaptive is very specific. Response is rapid in innate, while it is slow in adaptive. Potency, innate has got a limited or lower potency, while adaptive has got a very high potency. Memory, there is no memory in innate immunity, but there is a long-term memory with adaptive immunity. Now coming back to the same figure, when virus get attached to epithelial cells, is taken over by either macrophage or dendritic cell. Now, once these cells get infected with the virus, they become APC, that is antigen presenting cell. And this antigen presenting cell is taken to the lymph node. At the lymph node, they form a complex with MHC, membrane histiocyte complex. And this APC and MHC stimulates T0 cell, T lymphocyte. This T lymphocyte further gets divided into CD4 and CD8. Now, CD8 is a natural killer cell. It secretes enzyme known as granzyme, which kills any infected cell, and then it can be phagocytized. The CD4 cell, which gets further divided into TH1 and TH2. You must be wondering why I'm going into so much of details of this immune mechanism, but that's very important when you want to try any immunomodulator therapy. This TH1 is responsible for production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and this only, if it goes out of control, can land up with cytokine storm. While TH2 is anti-inflammatory. At the same time, TH2 stimulates beta cell where it goes for humoral type of immune response. I'm not going to go into details of this. I just would like to show you when there is an imbalance, between TH1 and TH2, the TH1 goes into exponential secretions of pro-inflammatory mediators. I'm not going to name it, but these are the pro-inflammatory mediators, and that is what we call it as a cytokine storm. At the same time, activated macrophage can cause hemophagocytosis, that is natural killing of red blood cells, and there would be drop in the hemoglobin. This cytokine storm can lead to fever or cytopenias, that is low count. And what would be the acute phase response in this? High levels of ferritin and low levels of fibrinogen. Other way, there can be organ dysfunction. It can be neurological, it can be liver, it can be acute kidney injury, it can be shock, ARDS, DIC, and so on. Coming back to this inflammatory response syndrome, whatever response takes place is by TH1 in the beginning, that is known as systemic inflammatory response syndrome, where it secretes pro-inflammatory cytokines. But whenever these pro-inflammatory cytokines is not under control or they grow exponentially, there is a peak. And this peak is known as cytokine storm. And it is basically made by IL-6 and TNF-alpha, which are pro-inflammatory cytokines. This can lead to early multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. If this doesn't land up with the cytokine storm, then there is a reaction from TH2 cell that is known as CARS, that is compensatory anti-inflammatory response. So homeostasis is maintained at the end. If patient is in this area, there won't be any complication and he would recover later on. But later on, there are also problems. If SIRS come under control, there is exponential rise in anti-inflammatory cytokines. And this can be IL-10 or tumor necrosis factor beta. And this leads to secondary infection and other complications. So in short, what you require is a homeostasis or control of the response of this TH1 and TH2 cell. Cytostorm is another name given to cytokine storm. Now coming to COVID-19, how to suspect cytokine storm? Any case who is suspected to have COVID-19 or confirmed case of COVID-19, there has to be laboratory evidence in the form of elevated levels of ferritin, C-reactive protein, or some pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-6 or TNF-alpha. What are the other laboratory findings which can suggest cytokine storm? Is D-dimer more than 1000, LDH more than 300, or reduction in the lymphocyte count, or there is a shiftment of NLR ratio, that is neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. Immunomodulation is therapy which alters the immune response. People were much interested in this immunomodulator since ages, but look at the failed trials. Not a specific immunomodulator can work or modify the outcome of sepsis. Coming to COVID-19, what have been tried as an immunomodulator therapy? One is hemofiltration, which is related to dialysis machine and the filters. Drugs like tocilizumab, Unila, steroids, Mycobacterium W, others, and lastly, mesenchymal stem cells. Hemofiltration, I will just give you a brief idea about this. Now, what is the basic concept behind this hemofiltration? See, when you are using immunomodulated drug, it is acting against one particular pro-inflammatory cytokine. But when you go for a hemoperfusion or hemoadsorption or hemofiltration, you are removing more number of pro-inflammatory cytokines. That is the basic concept behind this hemofiltration. The Ramco and Bellomo, who are famous nephrologists, has hypothesized that shaving of this cytokine peak concentration by removing them from the blood compartment during early phase of sepsis could stop inflammatory cascade. So this is the basic concept which is adopted for hemofiltration. And look at the meta-analysis. If you look at the meta-analysis, most of the hemofiltration techniques have been favorable results. There, the mortality has been reduced, or stay in ICU or stay in the hospital also has been reduced. Which are the techniques which has been used is high volume hemofiltration, plasmapheresis, coupled plasma filtration, adsorption, hemoadsorption, and high cutoff hemodialysis. I am going to talk in brief about this hemoadsorption or hemoperfusion. The blood is flown through a cartridge which consists of spherical balls of naturally occurring porous resins. What happens is that particular weight, molecular weight pro-inflammatory cytokines get adsorbed over the surface of this resin, and that is how they are removed from the circulation. But what is the problem with this blood purification techniques? One is the cost. The cost of the filter goes anywhere between 70,000 plus. Biocompatibility issue. Sometimes there is a removal of anti-inflammatory cytokines also. It causes leukopenia, it causes thrombocytopenia, or even it causes hypoalbuminemia. Coming to the drugs, I am not going to discuss about the steroids and others. Let's come back to TOSI. TOSI is specifically IL-6 receptor blocker. Other molecule which is available for this particular action is sarilumab. And the IL-6 particularly which blocks the production is citolizumab. Now what is the problem with this tocilizumab? It only blocks receptor of IL-6. Rest of the pro-inflammatory cytokines are free in the circulation. So tocilizumab meta-analysis, it has been used when IL-6 levels are raised by 5 to 10 times from the baseline. The recovery with TOSI is 45 to 54%. Secondary infection rate is pretty high. IL-6 level zooms up after using TOSI because it blocks the receptor. Single dose versus multiple doses, it's a debatable topic because people have tried single dose, people have tried double dose, people have tried more than 2 doses. No double-blind control trial is available. Italian trial related to TOSI has been stopped because it has not proven any benefits. This is used all over using TOSI. The incidence of secondary infection is there. It is much more if you use 2 doses of TOSI. The cost hovers somewhere around 40 to 80,000. The question is, are we overzealous in usage? A few days back, just 3 days back, this Cuvactide trial has been published, which is global randomized double-blind placebo-controlled efficacy of TOSI. What they did, they had taken COVID-19 patients, they are divided into 2 groups. One group with standard of care and TOSI is given. Another group, only standard of care has been given. So only standard of care is a control group. So what are the results? The difference in clinical status was insignificant. Measured in Tier 1 category ordinal care compared to placebo. Lastly, time up to hospital discharge or ready to discharge has been shortened with TOSI, but that is not statistically significant. In short, our bottom line is that TOSI is a failed molecule in COVID-19 as an immunomodulator. Olinastatin, the only data available with this is 12 patient data. Dose is 10 lakh units 8 hourly for day 1 to 4, that reduces it to 5. O2 requirement is reduced in 66%. CRP WBC reduced in 83%. LFT derange in 25%. So nothing more than this is available. But in India, phase 3 trials are ongoing. The cost of Unila is 42,000 for the total dose. Global usage in COVID has been stopped. We have used Unilastatin in few of the cases, but I'm sorry, I don't have that data right now. Coming to Sepsivac, as I told you, Sepsivac is a heat-killed Mycobacterium indica spinae or Mycobacterium W. The phase 3 clinical trials are ongoing in India at AIIMS and PGI Chandigarh. It is approved by DCGI and CSIR. The cost only 11,000 or less. Can try as an immunomodulator, or you can use it as a second dose to TOSI. Some people have also tried it as a prophylaxis for healthcare workers. Now, from where this idea came? basically this Mycobacterium W has been tried out way back for the treatment of tuberculosis and the Hansen's or leprosy. Leprosy, it has worked very well. Then people started using it in resistant type of tuberculosis. So this is an animal experiment. What they did, they have injected or infected mice, group of mice with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. I won't go into details of this study. One group is given anti-tuberculosis treatment. One group is given only Mycobacterium W, and the third group is given anti-tuberculosis treatment plus Mycobacterium W. And look at the clearance of Mycobacterium tuberculosis at the end of 4 weeks. This figure is at the end of 4 weeks. Lungs and splenic tissue. And you can see this last one. This is a combination therapy. And this is at the end of 6 weeks. Lungs, this is the combination which is working best. And spleen, it has almost clear Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So what it indicated, Mycobacterium W can act as a very good adjuvant immunomodulator. So what is the role of this MW in COVID-19? It stimulates Th1 cell. Th1 cell secretes interferon gamma, and which has got a very fantastic property which kills the infected cell. So this property can be used when you inject Mycobacterium W in COVID-19. It is TLR2 agonist, means toll-like receptor 2. Agonist means it favors the action of this particular receptor. It reduces cytokine production, pro-inflammatory cytokine production. At the same time, it activates dendritic cell and macrophages, which leads to the clearance of the virus. So this is another important property of this MW. Third property of MW is P38 downregulation, which leads to reduction in the levels of TNF alpha, IL-1B, and IL-6. All these three are pro-inflammatory cytokines. TLR4 antagonists. Remember this particular picture, the spike-case protein get attached to TLR4 receptor, and this particular receptor is blocked by MW, so it blocks the virus attachment. And few of the studies which were conducted in gram-negative sepsis, MW has shown to reduce all pro-inflammatory cytokines. Another mechanism, MW increases production of interferon gamma, and interferon gamma is known to decrease ACE2 expression, which reduces the entry of coronavirus into the cell. So that is another important property of this MW. Lastly, to conclude, if you compare with TOSI, which is the most popular molecule in the world today for the treatment of COVID-19 as an immunomodulator, this Sepsivac or MW controls total immune-mediated cycle, or it controls systemic inflammatory response syndrome. So it tries to bring the homeostasis because it has action on Th1, it has action on Th2. This study was, MW was studied in gram-negative sepsis, and I'm just going to show you it has statistically reduced the mortality in gram-negative sepsis. The trials are ongoing at all AIIMS and PGI Chandigarh. This was the first data which was published usage of MW in COVID-19. And I'm just going to show you the X-ray picture. Look at the X-ray in the beginning when MW was injected, and later on, look at the clearance on the right side of the X-ray chest. Our crude data, which we used at the Fortis, we used in 62 patients, where 57 were males, 5 were females, aged 20 to 68. Dose what we are given is 0.1 ml intradermal at 3 different sites into 3 days. We use this Sepsivac day 2 to day 4 of hospitalization. It was variable. It was not fixed that it should be day 0, day 1 or day 2. It was used at a variable times depending upon the CRP and IL-6 levels. In some cases, it has been used as a second drug after first shot of TOSI, where CRP levels have risen even after giving TOSI. What is the outcome? DAMA 6, discharge 47, still in hospital 7, and death 2. Means in total there were only 2 deaths, or mortality is very less. CRP levels within 2 days reduced in all cases. IL-6 levels within 2 days reduced in 48 cases, but increased in 14 cases. We don't know reason for this. There might be different type of response in different individuals. Heterogeneity, what we can call it. Karnataka government has inducted Sepsivac as a protocol treatment. Now, how to give this Sepsivac? That is very, very important. Your needle should be at a 10 degrees to the skin surface, something like this. You have to literally elevate epidermis after hooking the needle inside the skin. The sides, you can see the forearm, front of chest, or upper part of neck. This is how it should look. This is the exact way how to inject Sepsivac intradermally. Now, what about Sepsivac as a prophylaxis for healthcare workers? The dose is 0.1 ml intradermally. It reduces virus attachment, it improves viral clearance, and it maintains homeostasis. So these are the reasons why Sepsivac has been considered as a prophylaxis in healthcare workers. It has not been well studied. Few cases have been tried. For example, I tried this on myself. My younger son has injected it intradermally on the 7th of July. On 8th, the reaction was something like this. Now, why I'm showing you this picture? Because after injecting Sepsivac, there has to be reaction, induration or ulceration. That means it is working very well. For prophylaxis, if induration doesn't arise or doesn't form, then you have to repeat the dose after day 14. And this is after, on 22 days, after almost 15 to 20 days, the ulceration has appeared over here. I think that's all from my side. Thank you very much for the patient listening.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. That was a great presentation, I must say, and a very detailed one and quite critically analyzed. So this was an amazing one. That is all I must say. So,
Thank you so much.
Now moving forward with the third and the last presentation of today, before we move into the panel discussion. So now I would ask Dr. Sucheta to have her presentation, and let me share her slides. Hello, Dr. Sucheta.
Am I audible?
Yeah, ma'am. Please.
I'm not visible on screen. Dr. Mohit, I'm not visible on screen.
No, but ma'am, the slides are visible there.
Okay. Fine. Okay. Good evening, all. I welcome all, and I thank you for sharing your time with us. To start with, one of my friends asked me, what is the most important thing in life? I had to say, it's life itself. What else can be most important than that? And this is the reason we all are here and we are sharing the same screen today. Coming to the topic of discussion per se, it's Sepsivac, the rationale of use in critically ill patients. So, as you all know that this COVID-19 pandemic depicts figures of exponential spread of the virus, and a big healthcare challenge has been encountered due to this. But the most dreadful concern is why people are dying in a short span of time. And we are still struggling with that. And now the entire human species is in suffering and agony. And now we desperately need some promising remedy. So coming to the mortality factors, what are the underlying risk factors? As you all know that it's demographic data and vulnerability, susceptibility of the patient for the infection to go into the extreme spectrum of the disease. Yes, as being an eminent speaker, sir has very well elaborated age factor, which is very important. Associated comorbidities like diabetes, pre-existing cardiac diseases, pulmonary diseases, morbid obesity, smoking, and immunocompromised conditions. So in this context, I would like to just mention about a phenomena that has been coined by the Japanese scientist, that is Takotsubo phenomena. It's a broken heart syndrome. And in this, what happens actually, the heart behaves in a very bizarre way. If any enormous grief or anxiety is put on it. So when you disclose a report to a patient, and if patient come to know about his positive report, that anxiety, the magnitude of anxiety is such that patient land up with enormous kind of, patient land up into heart failure as such, because of the severe anxiety. The heart muscle, the cardiac muscle behave in a very bizarre manner. And this entity per se is approved by American Heart Association as well. So the word of caution is, whatever the report is disclosed to you, take it in a very calm way, and that will definitely help you to tackle the situation, whatever it is. Further moving forward, why complications are there in a low risk group? We are seeing patient healthy and they are without any comorbidity, but still we are facing complications in them. So first of all is, please previous slide. First of all is, it depends upon the virulence of the virus, which strain of virus you're tackling with. There are multiple strains, some are very benign and certain are highly virulent, and they act as a super antigen, and these viruses triggers the cytokine storm. Sir has very well elaborated what exactly the cytokine storm is. It is an enormous exaggerated immune response, like our own defense mechanism is bursting like anything. So to define it, it is an unorganized and unchecked immune response of the patient or the host. Now, why such response occurs? As I have told you, it is about the genetic configuration of the virus itself, or it's a genetic configuration of the host or the patient. Like what Journal of Virology says, that if there is a genetic mutation or alteration in the genetic code, or that depicts in defect in the TLR pathway, toll-like receptor signaling pathways, or defect in the chemokine receptor activity or cytolytic pathways, then it gives an exaggerated burst of immunity. So that's how patient goes into cytokine storm. And in USA, Dr. Lynn Lauret is conducting a study named as COVID Human Genetic Effort Study. He's studying upon in context of this COVID-19 infection, the genetic configuration, and maybe in due course of time will be available with some data in that context. So moving further, now this is the situation we are into. Now how to tackle it? What is the strategy of clinical management? Of course, you have to treat the underlying risk factors. As I have already enumerated in my earlier slides, the risk factors has to be taken care of, and the targeted therapy is to be emphasized on. It should be a precise one and not just polypharmacy. So that is the main principle behind this strategy. Yes, immunomodulation is very important, because if the patient goes into cytokine storm, we have to give a check in the form of some drug therapy. So this is a very vital element of the ongoing treatment. And we have to pick up the most important, the key is pick the cytokine storm early. As Sir says already, that in a second moderate phase, in a group 2A, where we see the patient is deteriorating, patient is showing a signs of organ dysfunction. This is the stage where patient is in delirium, patient is semi-conscious or losing his consciousness, unexplained tachycardia, unexplained low blood pressure, patient's urine output is declining, which is even less than 0.5 ml per kg per hour. So that is a sign that the cytokine storm is ensuing, and you have to really intervene at that point of time. Even ICMR says that if you feel the grade 2 patient in a moderate grade is worsening, then it is an alarming sign and has to be intervened. Yes, of course, there are role of biomarkers, but as a clinician, I always feel that we don't just merely only we treat figures, we treat patients. If as per the guidelines, if the cytobiological markers are not 3-fold, 5-fold, whatever, but if the trend is increasing, then it is a signal that patient is going into storm, and don't wait for the figures to reach to match the guidelines. You just intervene, and believe me, it will give you a better outcome. So now, what are the modalities of treatment? Yes, supportive treatment. Supportive therapy is very important. As when the patient landed up in the moderate grade, patient shows some signs of organ failure, especially desaturation. So you have to really maintain the airway, you have to maintain the oxygen therapy. And if the patient is showing hypotension, you have to give inotropic support. You have to give, if the patient is not having adequate urine output, you have to the patient, then this may become the worst outcome. So you have to really emphasize on the supportive therapy, as I've already narrated. There are a lot many antivirals in the market, whatever names I have quoted. So yes, of course, as per the recommendations, we can use them. And this is a battle against the virus, against the replication of the virus. But what we are emphasizing here is on the immune. So we have to simultaneously act on both the pathway. We have to decrease the effect of viruses, the replication of viruses as well, and we have to tackle the over immune response also. So it's a two-way therapy. Then come the roles of anticoagulants, as madam has said, that heparin or low molecular heparin, Clexane, as the trade name says. So this we have to use this because the pathogenesis of COVID-19 per se is an hypercoagulable state. So this is for the first time in the history of medicine we are using anticoagulants as prophylaxis for an infective etiology. But of course, their role is also mandatory and their role is also respected. Then comes the steroids. Yes, steroids plays vital role as a membrane stabilizing agents. They are immunomodulant as well, but their use is it has to be judiciously given to the patient, because if you don't weigh the risk benefit ratio, then you for extracting a small amount of benefit, you may land up with a big risk to the patient's life. So pertaining to the steroids, actually we need to be very cautious in terms of blood sugar levels, possibility of a vascular necrosis or delayed viral clearance, and many a time patient also goes into psychosis, and also the GI bleeding is one of the very common concern pertaining to the steroids use. Convalescent plasma. Yes, convalescent plasma is there, but the accessibility, it's not available at all corners of the hospital or all corners of the country. So it is still more of a theoretical aspect. So then we are left with the immunomodulator drugs. What immunomodulator drugs do we have? We have tocilizumab, itolizumab, and many others. And they are humanized artificial monoclonal antibodies. But the concern about this are they may affect liver. They may increase TL10 and tumor necrosis factor beta, and thereby they can depresses or suppresses the immunity in a very large magnitude. This is like inviting the superadded infection. Patient may have other bacterial or fungal infection. That is a big risk with tocilizumab. So then the other option is Sepsivac. It's a heat-killed Mycobacterium W. So actually it is indicated in gram-negative bacterial infection. Even before the advent of this COVID-19 pandemic, it was also in use, but it was for the gram-negative bacterial infection because it was more dreadful. And because pathogenesis resembles that of COVID-19, it was thought to use this in COVID-19 infection etiology. The underlying principle is it boosts the Th1 response, and thereby it increases the immunity against the virus. Next slide. But it is a smart molecule. What, to my experience, I would like to share that it is a small molecules. It also works on the negative feedback phenomena. If the immunity is going havoc in a one directional, propagated, exaggerated, it will see and it will give a negative signal to the precursor cells. So, and thereby it will block the inflammatory cascade. It inhibits the cytokines in the bloodstream. It inhibits cytokine-induced nitric oxide production. It also reverses the genetic change induced by sepsis, and thereby it restores the equilibrium between both the inflammatory and anti-inflammatory pathways. Yes. Now the first and most important concern is cost. Whatever antivirals are propagated, projected, and promoted, they are highly expensive. All immunomodulators come with certain amount of price, which is not affordable to the pocket of a person who belongs to very average socioeconomic strata. So pertaining to this, but when it comes to cost, we won't jeopardize on the efficacy of the molecule. So if we want an efficacious molecule and at a very reasonable cost, then of course Sepsivac is the best option left with us. So now Sepsivac, how to use, we know. Why to use, that also we know. Now when to use, this is the key decision, when to use it, and that will determine the actual outcome of the patient. So principles of use are at the onset of cytokine storm, at the moderate, as the risk has been stratified. So in the moderate zone of second A. So if you use it, then the results are really rewarding. Yes, you have to give an antibiotic coverage. Here comes the role of empirical antibiotics, because if patient is in an ICU with so many infectious pathogens around, so there is a fair chance that patient may have superadded infection. So you have to cover the patient with antibiotics. Then steroid. So if you are using any immunomodulator, so then you have to really think about the doses of the steroids. There is a phenomenon called synergistic effect. That is, both the drugs or the multiple drugs, they augment or potentiate each other's effect. So if 2 plus 2 actually becomes 5, so there will be a tremendous suppression of the immunity. So when you are using 2 or more drugs of the same mechanism, then you need to be very, very judicious. But with Sepsivac, of course, we have little more liberty to use a fair amount of steroids and give a membrane stabilizing effect to the cells. Because Sepsivac doesn't show any significant drug interactions. Now, pertaining to the cases we have treated with Sepsivac. There was one case, she was a young female with pre-existing pulmonary tuberculosis. She was already on anti-cox therapy or anti-tubercular therapy. So the LFTs, the liver enzymes, were on a little higher side. And she came with a full-blown cytokine storm. I still remember she was not able to sleep. She was just sitting, and she was so agitated that she was not following any verbal commands. And forget about prone position, she was not sleeping in supine position also. So then we thought, we have done her interleukin levels. The levels were not very high, but only little, we can say just 1.5 fold rise was there. So then we thought of starting her with Sepsivac, and we have started it. And on the third day, she started listening our commands. So that was the first positive response for us. But yes, pertaining to her clinical signs improved. The need of inotropes decreases, and she became more comfortable with oxygen. She could sleep supine. And then her shadows, the infiltrates on the X-rays were also getting diminished. And ultimately, she recovered, and she has been transferred out of the ICU. Second case was the case of a man, elderly man with a diabetic ketoacidosis. Patient was in a full-blown diabetic ketoacidosis, was having a shortness of breath with saturation of 83%. And ketones were present. Patient has an pH of 7.2, and then these bicarbs were too less. They were less than 2 as per the report. So then it was a severe case of ketoacidosis. So steroids were again a thing of concern for us, because to starting with high dose of steroid, then again this blood sugar level may rise. So then I just thought of giving Sepsivac to this patient. And patient, although was PCR negative, but he was having cough and basal infiltrates on the X-ray. So there was some sign. We have done his HRCT also. That HRCT revealed there is COVID-19 pattern of the infiltrates. So on the basis of that, we gave Sepsivac to this patient. And patient on 4th day, I suppose, yes, 3rd or 4th day, patient's saturation start improving. Patient was just on this prongs, nasal prongs with just 4 to 5 liters of oxygen. So thereafter, the need of the, oxygen was decreasing. Patient was able to speak without interruption. His consciousness level improved, and after a few days, patient, even the acidosis was taken care of. So he came out of the acidosis, soda bicarb level were corrected, and patient was, the condition was optimized. Then a third case, without, these 2 cases were without any comorbidity associated. One was an elderly patient, and he just came with lung infiltrates, bilateral pneumonia as typical of the viral infections. So he presented with shortness of breath with saturation of 85%. He was put on BiPAP with nasal cannula of 12/6 pressure with FiO2 of 0.8. And but his PCR was negative. As we all know that 36% of the PCR comes negative, but still we consider the patient as COVID, and we are treating them COVID as according to the other parameters. Like if the patient's HRCT is showing ground glass opacity and COVID-like pattern, then we consider the patient as COVID, and then we treat accordingly. So this patient was also given Sepsivac, and he also started improving. And there was also one young patient without any comorbidity. So he, with Sepsivac, he also is improving. Both these patients are in ICU now, but the good thing is that they are recovering, and they are without, means they are just not on without BiPAP. They are just maintaining saturation with nasal prongs with 2 liters of oxygen. The infiltrates on the chest X-ray are declining, and clinically patients are showing signs of improvements. So these were the cases to my experience. So I found it, Sepsivac, I really found as a smart molecule which knows how to act, when to boost the immunity and when to suppress it. So that's how it is working, and it is very coming in a very reasonably, it is cost effective. And I feel personally that if you use it judiciously in appropriate time, this is most important. If you use it at appropriate time, then you will definitely get a rewarding results. So the pearl of wisdoms to all my colleagues and friends, that you have to stay safe and save human and humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So again, the great insights into the critically ill patients and what should we be doing and what not. So this was an amazing presentation by you also. So now we are at the stage when we have complete the entire discussion, and we are at a frank amount of position where we have almost discussed the entire code picture and the place of multiple products and multiple options which are available. So just moving into panel discussion, and let us discuss 1 or 2 points which came out of this discussion, and I feel asking you, eminent speakers. So my first point or question that would go to Dr. Farah. Like, you already described the overall scenario about various stages of COVID patient and its characteristics. So how actually in clinical scenario, Dr. Farah, how do we actually identify the patient shifting the stages? Like, of course, many a time patient would come as asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic patient, and that is also evident that this disease worsens in no time. So how do we clinically pick that up?
Yeah, so we have to be very much watchful on the clinical parameters, actually the presentation, that is the form of the symptoms they come with, and also the lab parameters we have to be watchful for, and also how they are faring as far as the O2 saturation is concerned. Their respiratory rate is monitored, their blood pressure is monitored. the temperature is charted, and if the clinical deterioration in the form of symptoms occur, like patient becomes breathless, patient's fever is not subsiding, and the lab parameters, if they are deteriorating, like IL-6 going up, the CRP is going up, the fibrinogen D-dimers going up, these are all not good signs. LFT is getting deranged, RFT is getting deranged. Actually, patient can deteriorate in no time. You know, within a day also, patient can deteriorate. And initially, there are X-rays are normal, but later on, they develop pneumonias, DTOs, and pneumonias. So we have to be watchful. So we do investigations accordingly and keep a close watch on them, and accordingly we up titrate the treatment if required. That is the reason all the lab investigations are done so frequently in these patients. You know, sometimes we have to do CRPs every day. If the patient is stable, we do every third day. All these parameters helps us in assessing the clinical condition of the patient and accordingly modify the treatment. Otherwise, usually the complications of the cytokine storm which sets in is usually in the second week. It can happen even in the third week. And those patients who have comorbidities, like those patients with diabetes, hypertension, cardiac ailments, those who are immunocompromised, like those with cancers, elderly patients, for them specifically, we have to keep a very, very close watch and do the parameters as given in the guidelines, and accordingly upgrade or up titrate the treatment, and accordingly decide whether to keep the patient in the ward or ICU.
True.
That's how we do in our practice.
Yeah, true. So that was quite clarifying one. So, Dr. Atul, I'd like to ask you one question. Like, as you described the immune picture of these patients, like how it works and when actually it comes into the play. So, a very interesting diagram that you showed, which was talking about these various stages of the COVID-19 and role of viral load as well as the immune response in that. So what I could understand from that particular picture is the viral load is something which is majoritarily active during the initial phase of the disease course, but when you move towards the end of the disease course, that is into the critically ill patients or maybe moderate to severe, the viral load actually decreases. So what I suppose is its activity also might be decreasing, and actually the immune response which is taking over the condition. So would it actually be wise enough to put a big emphasis on giving antivirals into the late phases or the very severe cases of the COVID-19?
Yeah, we do. I have used antiviral remdesivir in some cases at very late stage, even after day 10. Then NLR ratio, I looked into it, and NLR ratio which is going above 10, and if patient is not given very high dose of steroid, I definitely go for remdesivir or antiviral.
So, sir, actually, sorry, ma'am, but what actually taught me in this direction is the data of remdesivir. Like remdesivir is anyway indicated into the critically ill patients of COVID, and what the trial actually told us that it does have effect in decreasing the virus load, but it doesn't actually have any impact on the reduction in the mortality, and that could be one of the reason, I suppose.
So you asked me question related to basically viral load and whether I would use antiviral in a later stage. See, you cannot judge viral load. There are no specified tests available which can give you idea regarding viral load. Many times virus is intracellular. It is phagocytosed by dendritic cell or macrophages. So you won't get clear cut easily. But ongoing process in the form of indirect marker, like a cytokine marker or ferritin or fibrinogen, CRP, IL-6, they will keep on giving you idea that viral load is not yet reduced. And most importantly, I would give immense importance to NLR ratio.
Actually, they say that the virus does not replicate after 10 days, but that's not there for all the cases. In some of the patients, it may continue replicating for a long time also. And now we have seen all over the world that the patients are getting reinfected. The second phase is coming up. So we really don't know much actually. So depending on the clinical status and the lab findings, you have to give antivirals also.
One more thing to add up, actually pertaining to this viral load, every kit is coming with different target genes, and it depends. The viral load will be variable for every kit, for every machine. You have to do certain standardization, which is not feasible as of now. To do a certain viral load is difficult at this point of stage.
No, and in the same patient also, it may give different viral load if you do at different times. You know, same patient you're doing today and tomorrow it may come different. So it's not always predictable.
True, true. So that that actually answers my question with quite a good elaboration. So, Dr. Meshram, I would like to ask you, like that happened to be asked by one of our delegate also, like what actually would be the most appropriate time when we think of giving Sepsivac, like patients parameters should be deranged, or in order to, like, as it was told in the presentations also, like it does stop the production of the cytokines from its root. So whether it is to give earlier and prevent that stage at all, or one we should be waiting for that.
Yeah, actually just giving for the sake of giving is not important. We need to know when. When is a very important criteria while deciding on this particular issue. So as I've already told with, and I've already mentioned in my slides, that it is the stage 2A, but don't go with that categorization. If clinically, if you're feeling that patient is going into signs of organ failure, you have to start the drug. So mostly when, if any of the sign I have told you, unexplained tachycardia all of a sudden, or hypotension, or if the urine output is a very important marker. If the urine output is less than 0.5 ml per kg per hour in a span of continuous, say, 6 hours, then it is an alarm to you that you have to start it. Some intervention is desperately needed.
So
can I add a point over here?
Sure, sure, sir, please.
I would suggest use of Sepsivac ASAP,
as soon as possible.
If you look at the action, it has action on PH1, ELR4 and ELR2. And most important action, what we use for healthcare work as a prophylaxis is it prevents attachment of virus to the cell. It blocks H2, it reduces H2 expression. EL4 is blocked. So, don't you want to use it in the beginning itself?
True. True. I do correlate with this thing. But sir, again, I would like to ask all three of you, like, as you all three have the first-hand experience of using Sepsivac. Once we give it, how do we actually come to know whether it's working or not? Like, how do we get an idea whether it is giving its effect, the desired one? Because of course, there is no surrogate.
By taking into account CRP levels.
Okay. So that would be one such marker that would tell us.
Yeah, that is one
CRP.
Clinical judgment. I mean, patients start showing clinical improvement. If patient is already on inotropic support, the need will decline. And the tachycardia settles, saturation settles. So that are the signs that patient is showing improvement with the drug.
Yeah, there are no mega studies for that as such, but then we do find clinical improvement, and we are monitoring CRPs, and we have seen that after giving Sepsivac, CRPs do come down. And of course, there is good clinical improvement, good clinical recovery after giving Sepsivac.
Yes.
They have not gone into complications, most of them actually. The cytokine storm has been prevented after giving Sepsivac in most of the patients. Yeah, that the data is not that robust, but we have up till now about more than, in fact, 70 patients we have given it up till now. Yeah.
Oh, great, great. And so that's a huge experience, the first-hand experience that you have, and of course, Dr. Meshram. So any associated side effects you observed in these patients whom you gave Sepsivac?
There are no side effects except local reaction.
That is the beauty of
that is the that is what.
Yeah, that's why we can do it. Initially, we thought, what would happen if you give it? Will it going to, the dictum in medicine, do not harm. So first of all, you are giving for the first time, you think whether it's going to harm to your patient. Then you think, anyway, it won't give you any benefit, at least it won't harm. So let us try. And in that decision, you extract benefit out of it. So to my experience, not much, not significant side effect, only that ulcer formation is that is still Okay,
But that's not a side effect. It is to say that it is working actually. That is how it works. You know, if there is no induration, that means it's not properly working actually. Yeah.
Yeah, that is true.
But it has to be given properly intradermally. If it goes to subcute or something, then you can get reactions and other things.
We have to watch the induration.
Yeah, induration.
If the induration is there, then it has been delivered properly. You can actually agree and you can rely on that.
Yeah, so sir, there is one important, like there's an interesting question by Dr. Puneet in the chat box that I'd like to put in here. Like what he's asking is why Self-Select is administered in 3 different areas. Like, is it painful or because it causes ulceration or any other reason? So, any thing you would like to comment upon, Dr.
Can I take that?
Sure, of course, sir.
See, if you look at it, it's
if you start with the left forearm, one dose, second dose of the same day, and third dose you can kind of do more than, because it is probably a convenient one, and if you are trying to hit it at a different and distant part of the body, so that if there is a problem with the kind of a pharmacokinetics, means movement of the molecule, because this Mycobacterium W is with the carrier. There is a vehicle, and the absorption may vary at different parts. That is the reason. Because next day you are going to repeat on the same arm. 1, 2, 3.
And also that much quantity we cannot inject intradermally at a time. So you have to divide and give also.
We need to keep a distance.
Yeah, distance actually. Yeah.
So, sir, I'd like to again add on to this one another point. Like when we are, as Ma'am Dr. Farah rightly said, we cannot inject more than 0.1 at one particular site intradermally. So that is again one thing. And by giving it at 9 different sites over the period of 3 days, what we are doing is we are exposing more dendritic cells and the Langerhans cells to this antigen per se, and which would again help boosting immunity in a faster manner. And second thing, at different sites, so what basically would happen is from the site of inoculation via lymphatic channels, it would go to the nearby lymph nodes, wherein again it would be working on the immune cells. So more the lymph nodes and immune system we cover at the first place would be better, the way I see it, sir. So again, there is another point been asked by Dr. Puneet again, is dose and dosage of Ecosprin and what ADR should be monitored, something like pulmonary hemorrhage or in the management of COVID. So what he wanted to ask is about Ecosprin.
Yeah, Ecosprin actually we given the dose of 75 milligram. Ecosprin has been shown to have anti-inflammatory, anticoagulant, and even antiviral activity, and also has got anti-lung injury effect also. And it has been shown to reduce the number of hospital days when given early in the COVID. And secondly, even the cardiovascular mortality is reduced with Ecosprin. But then if there are side effects, then accordingly you have to adjust. You may get that. Bleeding and all can happen. GI side effects can be there. But otherwise, it's a very good drug, and we are using it for all the patients, except those with bleeding tendencies and all. Otherwise, we are using it, and we are getting good response. No side effects we have seen so far with Ecosprin, and about 800 patients we had seen.
Okay. Any add-on, Dr. Meshram, to this? Would like to...
we are using Ecosprin at a dose of 75 milligram OD, that is once a day. And yes, apart from its antiviral, antiplatelet effects, it has added beneficial effect, as Madam has already narrated. So it is beneficiary to the patient. And as such, the pathogenesis of the COVID is in hypercoagulable stage. So anyway, it is going to give you protection.
So there is another question coming up by Dr. Mehta, like can Ecosprin be co-administered with LMWH, low molecular weight?
Yes, we do give. We do give both together, yeah.
We are giving in a patient.
Yeah, we are giving.
Anyway, we are giving.
Yeah.
So that's the
So Dr. Atul, I'd like to ask, put this one question for you specifically, like Dr. Rajkumar is asking, like, can it be taken by medical professionals on prophylactic basis? So from the company side, if I would like to say, per se, we are yet into the trials, but what would be your opinion?
See, nothing is available right now as a prophylaxis for healthcare workers. Anyway, healthcare workers are taking HCQ every week. And there are no side effects. That is the reason I tried that on myself, with my family members, and then we injected to my body.
Yeah.
Trial,
Something like a BCG vaccine.
when you are injecting yourself a single dose, first of all, it is confirming the efficacy of your old BCG vaccine. If you get your that is one.
And secondly, I am both in active and
we're not following it.
that is still approved.
Touch wood. Touch wood.
That's quite good. That's quite good. So
Because we are having,
yes, sir. Sorry.
we are having
I'm having hypertension and diabetes.
True. Okay, sir. So all three of you have used tocilizumab. Like there is one question that I could see. Like what would be the side effects? You already, Dr. Atul, have narrated that it does increases the rate of secondary infection, being it a immunosuppressant. But apart from that, did you observe any other side effects associated with toci?
Yeah, actually there can be a number of side effects, but usually minor. Serious ones are only secondary bacterial infection, which we have seen gram-positive, gram-negative infections, sepsis, and even the fungal infections. But minor side effects could be in the form of stuffiness of nose, sinusitis, sore throat, myalgias, which are like COVID symptoms only. So these are all the minor symptoms, and mostly it is a secondary bacterial infection, and that is also like because this was used for rheumatoid arthritis. We used to give it in the subcutaneous form, and there where patients are on methotrexate also, you can get the incidence of secondary bacterial infection is very high. But here also we have seen many patients having secondary bacterial infection. Minor side effects, okay, running nose and myalgias and headaches and sinusitis, sore throat, that should go away. That's not very important actually.
Yeah, here I would like to add that it acts only in one direction, that it is just suppressing the immunity. What about if a full-fledged cytokine storm is ensued? There need some check. So this is just suppressing the immunity and inviting other infections. Yes, and cost is also one of the very important concerns. It's highly
40,000 for one vial. Yeah.
Do you know any peculiar problem about this tocilizumab? It is not indicated subcutaneous in COVID.
Yeah, correct. In rheumatoid we give subcut, but here you have to give IV only.
IV only.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true, sir. So Dr. Narayan Mishra asks, will the steroids affect the efficacy of Sepsivac?
No,
So,
I don't think so. Nothing to do with the efficacy.
So how about using it along with the other? Sorry, ma'am.
But then the chances of secondary infection may be high with steroids and toci given both. Otherwise, the efficacy is not.
Sepsivac.
Sorry. Sepsivac, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how about using Sepsivac along with the other investigational molecules like remdesivir, tocili, ETO, even ulinastatine?
We have used with all. Huge. Everything we have used.
Verify that it is antiviral.
True.
It is antiviral, it is immunomodulator. So both the categories are different.
True. And Dr. Sheikh is asking, can tocilizumab be given when the procalcitonin is higher?
Shall I answer it?
Sure, ma'am. Sure, please.
Just I have told you, we don't treat only figures. We treat patient. We have to correlate with the patient. So if the patient is showing signs of, it means patient is showing signs of worsening, and procalcitonin is rising. It may not be as per the guidelines 4-fold or 5-fold or whatever, but you have to correlate both. So procalcitonin is a sign, it's an alarm. So if you are convinced that clinically patient is correlating with the value, then you can start. And rather I will say you have to start.
Oh, that's quite true. And there is one question: how about the chances of recurrence of COVID? Like once we give this Sepsivac, or maybe any other drugs per se. Dr. Farah, Dr. Atul. Yes, there is some. Okay, Dr. Farah.
We were disconnected.
Yeah, I thought so.
Well, it has not been documented because this disease is pretty new. But as we are trying Sepsivac as a prophylaxis, I don't think there is any chance of.
With good immunity, less chances of infection. Hopefully, we can think that way. That's all.
True. So that's a quite a great the post session discussion we had. So I'd like to open the session for say to have some discussion with the audience also. So I'd like to again ask all the delegates that now you would be able to unmute yourself and put forward your point of discussion if at all you want to get something discussed and which we might have missed in today's session. So anyone wants to put any questions or queries or discussion?
Dr. Mohit, Dr. Mohit, good evening. Good evening to all of you. It was an excellent session, I can say, and we could share our experience on this particularly. I have not yet used this, but can you just tell me, I asked this question, how many RTCA has been done and where it has been done?
Okay. Sir, the first thing is the major RCT that we had was for the gram-negative sepsis indication for this, and it was comprising of 202 patients, and the main stakeholders in that RCT was PGI Chandigarh, PGI Rohtak, and there were other centers like across India.
No, I mean particularly in COVID. Particularly
so there were COVID. Multiple gram-negative sepsis. For COVID.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So
COVID, AIIMS, Delhi,
already
Bhopal.
initiated this.
Okay. My second question is, can it be given during pregnancy? During pregnancy.
Yeah, because these trials are quite into very controlled conditions. So we for the special population like geriatric or pediatric and pregnancy, the separate trials are altogether required. So we currently don't have that data about Sepsivac usage in pregnancy. And sir, as you are asking, these trials, there are 3 trials which are ongoing currently. For the role of Sepsivac as a prophylaxis, for the role of Sepsivac in the early cases of COVID, and for the role of Sepsivac into the ICU. Going, so we are waiting for the data right now.
Dr. Narayan,
In point 1 actually.
Thank you, ma'am.
You've got good response. Thank you.
Thank you.
Narayan,
Madam, what is the scientific explanation?
Well done, sir. Well done.
Thank you.
Sir, what is the scientific explanation of this giving prophylactic tocilizumab?
Prophylactic tocilizumab we don't give actually.
Sir, one of the speaker has said no that I have also taken. Sir was showing
Sepsivac. Yeah,
Okay.
it is Sepsivac.
But they are the same, no?
No. They are different. They are totally different.
No, they are given in the cytokine storms only, no? Both them.
Sepsivac is given. Yeah.
Dr. Atul, there is some problem with the audio from your side.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
This thing. One second.
Sure.
Take this.
Sorry.
Yes, sir. Now you're audible.
See, if I am audible,
You can hear me?
Yes, sir.
see, tocilizumab acts on IL-6 receptor. IL-6 is only one of the pro-inflammatory cytokines. And tocilizumab blocks one particular pathway or two particular pathways. Right? Cepsivac is totally different molecule altogether. It's mode of action.
Cannot hear, please. That अब्दुल का तो इतना बेकार है उसका तो बिल्कुल.
Cannot hear.
Yes, can't hear. Yes, you are right, madam.
Okay.
Hello, now I'm audible.
Quite very good, sir.
Yes,
Now
sir.
it is, sir.
I'm so
Yes.
sorry. I'm using my wife's microphone.
Yeah, no.
See, IL-6 is only one in pro-inflammatory cytokine. Tocilizumab blocks only IL-6 receptor. So it is very, very specific. But Cepsivac has got a multipotential action or pluripotential action. It acts at the cellular level. It acts at the receptor level. It acts at the cytokine level. So you cannot compare Mycobacterium W or Cepsivac with Tocilizumab. Am I clear about that?
Yes, sir. Only, but they are both are given for the pathophysiology of the cytokine storms when they are increasing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But
Then how do we
Tocilizumab,
know that when should be given what?
now, if you compare the trials, Tocilizumab has been used when IL-6 levels are raised 5 to 20 times from the baseline.
Okay.
So that molecule is particularly used for cytokine storm.
Yes, yes.
And this Tocilizumab is never used to prevent attachment of virus or virus multiplication or as a preventive or prophylaxis. Right?
Right, right.
Now, Cepsivac starts acting right from the attachment at the ACE receptor because it reduces number of ACE expression. It blocks TLR4 receptor. So attachment is also reduced. It stimulates TH1 cells, which goes for a killing of the infected cells. So it starts working from the stage 1 itself. So
Right.
you can use it as a prophylaxis also. So
Okay.
you cannot compare this. Cepsivac has got a pluripotential action.
Right, right, sir.
Thank
Right,
you.
sir. Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I have a personal experience with Cepsivac. Can I share?
Sure, sir. Please.
Yeah. So I have taken Cepsivac last Sunday, and along with me, I have given to my parents and my brother also. But the reactions were different. I got ulcerated on third day itself, whereas for my parents and my brother, they just got induration only. And I'm the only healthcare worker. I'm a pulmonologist, and I also worked in Gulf during the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. And as we know that there is a 50% similarity with COVID and all these things. And my Cepsivac got ulcerated very fastly. Is there something related to these things or it is natural?
Sir, your immunity is very strong.
So
No, I'm honestly speaking. Your immunity is very strong. That is the reason you got ulceration at the earlier stage. So that's a delayed reaction. And time taken is very short. So you should be happy about it.
I'm also in COVID duty since 3 months. And so this induration and after getting your talk, I'm more happy to know that I have been covered very early. Thank you. Thanks for that.
That's great. That's great. Any other questions, please?
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello. Good evening, sir. Sir, I need a question regarding the uses of oral anticoagulants even after using LMWX for nearly about 10 days, even when the D-dimer is on the higher side. So what is the role of oral anticoagulants? So how long we should give at the time of discharge?
What protocol we are following at the Fortis that I will tell you. We have gone through multiple studies and it has been shown that there were thromboembolic phenomena even after 2 to 3 weeks after the discharge. So we are giving apixaben 2.5 or 5 milligram twice a day for 1 month. even though D-dimer is on the higher side.
Okay.
And
Even
it has shown the protective effect.
okay. Even after giving LNWX during the hospitalization.
Yes.
So you will same like warfarin. You need to bridge with apixaban, or just at the time of discharge you can give 5 mg BD for 1 month.
Basically, okay. I'll ask Dr. Farah to answer this particular question.
Hello.
Yeah. Yes,
Hello.
ma'am.
Yeah, sorry. Can you repeat the question, please?
Ma'am, what is the role of oral anticoagulants even after giving LMWX for about nearly 10 days during
No,
hospital?
that's what, as we had been repeatedly saying, that this is a hypercoagulable state, and the patient's presence with infarcts, with strokes, and there are reported cases where patients were brought dead actually after 2 weeks to 3 weeks also after discharge when they were all right. So that is why we continue giving NOACs, that is apixaban, or even you can use edoxaban or rivaroxaban, anything, for a period of 4 to 6 weeks. That is what is advocated in selected patients, not for all patients actually. And low molecular weight heparin we give only for about a week and then shift on to oral. And you were talking something about warfarin, no?
Yes, ma'am.
So
do we need to bridge apixaban like same what we use for warfarin?
No, because warfarin we are not using because it requires PT-INR monitoring. So that is why this does not require monitoring. That is the reason we are using apixaban. So, and initially when the patient is on low molecular weight heparin, when you want to start warfarin, you have to start on the 2nd day or 3rd day itself, monitor PT-INR. Once it comes to 2, 2.5, then you can stop low molecular weight heparin. But apixaban can be started upfront. So after 7 days of low molecular weight heparin, we switch on to apixaban. So that is easy and it does not require so much of monitoring.
What is the criteria for starting apixaban? For all, you said only for selected patients. So what
not like mild cases, those who are ambulatory and all, we don't start actually. So only those
for all
comorbid cases, comorbid patients who are not that ambulatory, cardiac issues, then we are giving them, yes.
Okay, ma'am. So this is 5 mg BD for 1 month.
No, initially we start with 10 mg BD if the low molecular weight heparin is not going on to the patient. If you're starting it upfront, if you're starting it after low molecular weight heparin, then we give 2.5 at the time of discharge, 2.5 BD for 1 month to 6 weeks.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, thank you.
Ma'am, just a follow-up. This is Karl Mehta from Bangalore here again.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you that for giving apixaban, can we give it for even our COVID negative? People have come COVID negative, but the CT and clinical. So we can continue in those people. But the challenge I have is that the patient gets better and then it's time to get discharged on day 5 or day 7, depending. And then they say, no, we're normal, we don't want to take. I mean, they're not compliant with the treatment
correct.
going
with the
forward.
Injectables. Yes,
So
that's true.
that's
the reason we switch on to oral, correct.
No, ma'am, even oral, they're not taking the rest of the course.
But if you explain them properly, then they will follow. We'll have to give a little more time to them to explain.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam, how to anticoagulate for low platelet count patients?
No, we have to monitor the platelet count. Actually, in COVID, the thrombocytopenia is there, but it's not that much as compared to dengue or other illnesses. So you can, if the platelet count is about 1,80,000, also we give NOACs. We have to monitor the patient.
Thank you.
Hello, Arun Kamble from Pune, madam.
Yeah.
What is the ICMR guidelines about Sepsivac?
ICMR guidelines have not come yet, actually. It is in the experimental phase. The trials are still going on, no? Actually.
Okay.
But then it has approved, it has been approved by DCGI now. So it may be included in the guidelines. 1 second, Dr. Ingle will talk about it. ICMR guidelines for Sepsivac.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah,
good evening, sir.
Good evening. Karnataka government has inducted Sepsivac in their protocol. ICMR is not yet because control trial has yet to come out.
Yes.
Oh.
Sure. Yes, sir.
How it is available? If it is available?
Yes, it is.
Really
it is. Yeah, it is available. So you can use it. So, sir, should we be calling it the end, Dr. English?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, Dr. Bhardwaj.
डॉक्टर अतुल नमस्कार, गुड इवनिंग।
हाँ हाँ, आपको पहचाना हमने।
कैसे है सर? बढ़िया,
बस बढ़िया। आप कैसे हो?
जस्ट सर, if patient is suffering, patient is COVID positive with ITP, idiopathic thrombocytopenia, then we should use the Ecosprin or LMW or not?
Oh, that's not my domain.
My friend mother is suffering from the COVID. She's ITP patient already.
1 minute. ITP patient.
Hello.
Madam, yes.
Because of disturbances, actually, we have to switch sides. Actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
My question is that my friend mother is suffering from. She's now COVID positive.
Okay.
She's already being treated since long back for the ITP.
Okay. Yeah.
So we should monitor the platelet.
Correct.
And we use the Ecosprin or LMW or not?
No, we do use, but we see in ITP usually there is no bleeding, and the little low level of platelet also is okay. But if there is bleed or something, then we stop it. Otherwise, we give in even ITP also.
LMW or Ecosprin?
Both we can give. Yes.
Okay.
But then if there is a bleed, then we don't give. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I ask one question? Please?
Sure, sir. Sure, please.
Yeah. My question is to Dr. Farah. Yeah, and Dr. Have you used all the 3 drugs in a given patient? All of them, Sepsivac, Remdesivir, and Tocilizumab?
Yeah, we had used. Yes.
Okay.
As antiviral Remdesivir, and for the serious patients, actually, we have used all 3. Yes.
Right. Thank you, sir.
So much. Thanks.
Dr. Mohit, one clarification. Dr. Narayan Mishra. So you have got this sample containing 0.6 ml, and you are recommending 0.1 ml for 3 consecutive days in 3 places.
So 0.3 ml per day for 3 consecutive days. 0.3 ml. 0.3 ml intradermally per day for 3 consecutive days. But sir, intradermally 0.3 won't be possible to inject. So we divide the dose of 0.3 ml into 3 injection of 0.1, which are to be given at different sites.
Okay. So, but it contains 0.6 ml total.
ml. Yes, sir. So one patient would require 2 vials. Why we have kept it on a higher side is just to be sure that the patient is getting the enough quantity, because sir, what happens is we are withdrawing 0.1 ml, which is a very minute quantity. So there are sometimes calibration, over calibration, or sometimes there is some drug left out in the head of the needle. So to be on a safer side, we have we are providing the drug into a bit higher side. So 2 vials would do in 1 patient.
Okay. That was my concern.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I add one point?
Yes, sir.
You should use insulin syringe. That is the best way to use it.
True.
That's what we are using. Actually, we are using insulin.
Because company provides 26 number needle.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
True, sir. So
great.
Yes, sir.
Hello, this is Dr. Shreyas from Mysore.
Yes, sir.
Who are on Sepsivac prophylaxis, like as a healthcare worker, can they take HCUS also, or we are seeing from the opposite ends? You won't recommend it. I mean, hydroxychloroquine also is prophylaxis, or you advise to choose one?
You can go for both.
Okay.
You can go for both.
Okay. And is aspirin 75 mg also advised as a prophylaxis or not?
No, not as a prophylaxis.
Thank you.
If you are having comorbid conditions like diabetes and hypertension, that is a different issue. But if now, no.
If there's a comorbid issue like hypertension, but under control, would you recommend?
Yes.
But for Ecosprin, there's no room for primary prevention, sir. But if the patient is COVID positive, then you do depend on Ecosprin, actually.
Okay. So after a person who is hypertensive, if they turn COVID positive, then
should we start from day 1 itself? Yes.
Yeah, if not, no. I mean,
because for Ecosprin, actually, the aspirin, there's no role of primary prevention, no, for primary prevention.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Dr. Atul?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Karl from Bangalore again. In what percentage of COVID positive patients with comorbidities are you seeing renal shutdown, kidney AKI, where the creatinine where the urine output suddenly drops, creatinine just comes up to around 2.5, 3 when the baseline is normal?
I had seen few cases of acute kidney injury, but I would relate it to remdesivir. Not because of COVID. After initiating remdesivir, suddenly there is a drop in GFR, rise in the creatinine, and you can anticipate you have to stop remdesivir, and they are becoming all right. But chronic case, patients like diabetic or hypertensive who are having baseline CKD, they are having sometimes problem, mild different deterioration of the GFR, rise in the creatinine, but you treat it and then it comes down to the baseline. But it is more so because if you look into the global data also, there are complications in the form of acute or AKI on CKD. AKI is very, very rare. Even though they say that virus is excreted via urine, you have to isolate person after the discharge. Even he has to use separate toilet. But kidney involvement per se because of virus is quite rare. It is more so because of the cytokine storm or systemic inflammatory response syndrome.
Yeah, pertaining to the remdesivir, actually we need to be cautious while administering SUQ along with that, because they may aggravate QT interval prolongation. So you have to keep a watch.
SUQ is not advocated for serious patients as such. It's
but we are
mild cases.
And remdesivir is toxic also. We have seen so many patients after second and second dose itself, LFT is going haywire. And we need that we have to stop remdesivir. Bilirubin going very high, the enzyme going very high. After stopping, it immediately starts coming down also. So it's very bad hepatic effect and even the renal effect.
And drug interactions are also there.
Yeah.
Dr. Farah,
yes.
We are the family physician and treating the patient isolated at home. When earliest we can start the antiviral?
See, the sooner you start, the better it is. The day you are diagnosed with
COVID plus.
Yes. So the mild cases, you should start immediately.
And you have to get 400 2 times for day 1 and then 400 once a day for another 4 days. Earlier you start, the better it is.
Okay.
So of course, cardiac toxicity has to be monitored if you are elderly or if you have comorbidities like cardiac problems. So ECG should be done, ideally baseline.
Okay. Thank you.
Guidelines is saying that favipiravir is the molecule which is to be started at the earliest phase, even if the mild symptoms.
Yeah.
Start with that molecule.
Thank you.
So I guess Dr. Atul, Dr. Farah and Dr. Mishram, we should be calling this a end now.
Yeah.
And we have anyway stretched it for a great long, and actually time flew by and we didn't even realize, because the way discussion was going in, it was such a feast of knowledge we had today. So I must say, it was because of you three dignitaries that we have, along with the participation from audience, that actually made this conversation quite very interesting. So at this point of time, I would like to thank all three dignitaries, Dr. Atul, Dr. Farah, as well as Dr. Sucheta, to accept our invitation, and you made yourself available and made such a nice presentation, and the dedicated participation into this discussion. So we are so very thankful to all you three dignitaries. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And at the same time, I'd like to thank all the dignitaries who attended the webinar and take active participation into the panel discussion and the after session queries. So we thank all the participants, and we are looking forward to have this association with all of you for our future programs, as well as all the scientific events that we are planning. So thank you all, and have a good night, and stay safe.
Yes, Dr. Mohit.
Yes, sir.
Take vaccine also.
I've taken, sir. I've already taken it. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Take care.